We have now reached the keynote address portion of the program today with Professor Michael Keefer of the University of Guelph, Professor Emeritus, and he will speak to the big picture.
It could have been called the tall picture. I think I'm going to sit here at the desk rather than at the lectern because I would have to bend over the lectern. I'm not sure that it can be lifted quite to my height. I've been working on issues of electoral fraud as a kind of perverse hobby, one might say, for over a decade. I'm a professor of English literature, but I'm interested in deceptions of all kinds, whether in fiction or in the world of politics. And I've been publishing, I began publishing on American presidential elections immediately after the 2004 election, which was marked by scandalous levels of fraud, and indeed falls easily into the category of a stolen election. There's massive evidence to show that. Now, what I think I would like to do as expeditiously as possible for you is to run through what I think some of the key information is that you can take into your reflections on the upcoming 2015 election. I'd like first to supplement the very helpful information that Susan Watson gave us. There is an additional resource that I would recommend to you, which you can access at www.thescriptfilmco.com. This is a documentary film in progress being made by the Ottawa documentary filmmaker Peter Skuzinski. And you can see at that website samples of the interviews that he has already done. And you'll also see a request for assistance with crowdfunding. At the moment, I think he's traveling to the West Coast to raise money for his film. He'll be speaking to large audiences in Victoria and elsewhere. If you're impressed by what you see, I would urge you to think about supporting that project. Now, the big picture, let's consider first some numbers. How many fraudulent telephone calls were there in Canada? Nobody can say with any degree of precision, but we do have evidence from three useful sources. There are polls that were conducted in early 2012 by two highly respected polling companies, Ipsos Reid and Ecos Research. And there are the, to my mind, thoroughly inadequate, but nonetheless useful, records of complaints that Elections Canada kept. They only began to get serious about complaints some months after the election, by the way, so their records are by no means accurate. What these three sources can tell us is the following. There were, as everyone knows, but it's very easy to forget, there were two kinds of fraudulent vote suppression calls during the 2011 election. There were harassment phone calls that began, in some writings, at the very beginning of the election campaign, March 26th. Eglinton Lawrence, there were reports of harassment calls coming in from the very beginning and right through the election. Some of you may have received these calls because they were reported from Guelph. These were calls, you might receive automated calls at 2 in the morning saying, will you please support your Liberal candidate, sometimes in a tinny mechanical voice, almost designed to annoy. If you slam the phone down, it might ring again 10 minutes later and wake you up again with the same request. Or it could be a live operator phone call that might have come into your home on Easter Sunday. Or if you're Jewish, perhaps in the middle of the Pesach dinner. You'd be interrupted just as somebody is reading the 4 questions, the answer to which is, of course, why is this night different from all other nights? And the telephone would ring with a 5th question saying, this is your Liberal candidate, will you please, blah, blah, blah. Which is, of course, designed to aggravate people. Surprisingly, according to Elections Canada data, 51% of the total complaints received were about harassment calls. 49% were about misinformation calls, which began to come in on April 29th, first live operator calls, and then on the day before the election and election day, massively robocalls, which were, as everybody knows, the calls that sent people to non-existent or to incorrect polling stations, invariably further away from their homes than their actual polling stations were. Now, the data from the two pollsters, Ipsos Reid and Ecos Research, give us information only about the misinformation calls. Ipsos Reid found that 4% of Canadians had received such calls. Ecos, whose poll had a larger sample size and was, I think, more reliable, came up with a number of 2.3%. Ipsos, I think, went astray because their sample was very largely an Ontario sample. And I believe that what their data shows us is that the misinformation fraud was indeed concentrated very largely in Ontario ridings. What they did was to extrapolate their Ontario data nationally, and I think that led them astray a little bit. Okay, in round numbers then, those figures, the Ecos research figures, which I take to be the more reliable, tell us that there were something like 550,000 fraudulent misinformation calls received by Canadian voters in the last days of the 2011 election. If we add to that the complaints data from Elections Canada, we get an aggregate number of substantially more than 1.1 million fraudulent calls across Canada during that election. 1.1 million vote suppression calls, which of course did not go out randomly. 261 ridings are recorded as having sent complaints into, or people from 261 ridings complained to Elections Canada. In many of those ridings, the calls appear to have been scattered, possibly occurring only in several polling districts. We really don't know. There are at least 24 ridings which were seriously bombarded by thousands of fraudulent calls. So there you have some numbers. By the way, the question always arises, how effective are robocalls? Well, robocalls are not going to work in any subsequent election in this country because we know about them. But in 2008, in the riding of Saanich Gulf Islands, there was a kind of, if you like, laboratory test of what robocalls can do. When shortly before election day, the NDP candidate was obliged to withdraw from the race due to a kind of silly scandal involving stupid behavior from 12 years before. His name remained on the ballot papers. Now, a poll taken in that riding indicated that whereas in the previous election, the NDP had received 26-point-something% of the vote in Saanich Gulf Islands, that was in 2006. A day or two before the 2008 election, less than 1% of people intended to vote for the NDP. In other words, fewer than 1% of voters didn't know, hadn't been following the news, didn't know that there was no NDP candidate still in the race. Now, on the day before the election, the riding was bombarded with robocalls which purported to come from the NDP campaign office, saying, get out and support Julian West, our candidate. He's a great guy. We really want him representing us in Ottawa, etc., etc. With the result that 5.7% of the electorate in Saanich Gulf Islands voted NDP. In other words, 4.7% of the people in that riding were deceived by the robocall into throwing their votes down the drain. So there are some numbers for you. The estimates, by the way, of the impact, the kind of percentage impact of the robocalls in 2011 come to us from two sources. One is Ecos Research, whose estimate is that there was a vote suppression effect of, on average, 1.5% in the 7 subject ridings that they studied for the Council of Canadians supported law case. 1.5% doesn't sound like much, but if you remember that these were ridings, most of which had a very close race, and that the range of vote suppression effects that ECOS recorded was actually between 1.2 and 1.8%, with a margin of error in both directions beyond those numbers. That is more than sufficient to have altered the results in, by my estimate, 4 of the 6 ridings that were ruled on by Judge Richard Mosley. An economist from Simon Fraser University did a study in early 2012, Anke Kessler is her name, which used a completely different range of methodologies, very sophisticated statistical work, focusing on 24 ridings in which the reports, according to Elections Canada information, of misinformation robocalls were most intense. She found a 2% vote suppression effect, which amounted in those ridings on average to something like 2,000 votes per riding. Now, this is of course not material that one can say proves anything beyond doubt, but it does suggest very strongly that there's not merely a significant ethical issue involved here as to how anyone can trust the organization responsible for this fraud in the future. But there's also a serious question as to whether the government that now holds a majority as a result of the 2011 election won that majority through fraud. There's the evidence, by the way, as I'm sure you are aware, points very strongly, all of the available evidence, to that guilty organization being the Conservative Party of Canada. The evidence includes internal Elections Canada emails, Elections Canada officials who were receiving the early reports of fraudulent phone calls in the days before the election, fraudulent misinformation calls, which came with callback numbers that in many cases led not, as one of our fellow citizens has said, to numbers in the United States or in faraway places, but led to Conservative Party campaign office lines. In other words, the connection was direct. There's a great deal more information, which I think I'll just pass over for the moment. Perhaps it can come up in question period. Information leading to the conclusion that the Conservative Party was the organizing agency. Now, I think one important matter to understand, in Guelph in particular, is how seriously we were let down by the investigation of this crime. We were let down across Canada by the fact that the only riding in which there was anything resembling a serious investigation was in fact Guelph. But we were also let down in Guelph itself. And let me explain why. What we know about from court documents, from newspapers and so on, are the so-called Guelph calls. Pierre Poutine, alias Pierre Jones, who organized a burst of robocalls that went out between 10:03 and 10:14 on the morning of May the 2nd to something like 6,500 Guelph residents, giving them misinformation about their proper polling station. Now that is the only set of fraudulent calls that were investigated in Guelph. Elections Canada, or the Elections Canada investigator working in Guelph, also had very clear indications, very clear evidence that there were other calls in addition to those fraudulent calls. How do we know this? Because as soon as the Elections Canada office opened at 10 minutes to 9 on May the 2nd, it was flooded with complaints from Guelph residents. This is more than an hour before the Poutine calls went out. At 9:30, when the old Quebec Street Mall polling stations were opened, the Elections Canada official responsible for that polling station reported that people began immediately showing up who had been deluded by fraudulent phone calls and sent to the wrong polling station. We also know, and again the Elections Canada investigator knew, that there were calls in the afternoon These were in fact mentioned in the Guelph Mercury on May the 2nd, 2011, in which people were informed, I'm awfully sorry, but the polling stations have closed early, so don't bother voting. If you look at the court documents, the information to obtain documents filed by the Elections Canada investigator, Alan Matthews, you discover that he only asked for information about calls sent out from the Edmonton voice broadcaster RAC9 on May the 2nd, or calls that were linked directly to Conservative Party officials. In other words, any surreptitious calls from RAC9 as part of the fraud earlier than May 2nd, he received no information about, and we therefore know effectively nothing about them as well. How many of the complainants in Guelph were contacted by Elections Canada? 379 complaints were recorded in Guelph. 18 people were contacted. None of the people on the second list sent to Alan Matthews by the Liberal Party, only 5 people on the first list of 79 people that were sent by Frank Valeriotti's office to Al Matthews. The Green Party and the NDP indicated to Elections Canada that they also had lists. They were not contacted, at least according to the court documents, perhaps I can be corrected on this. They were not contacted for information as to who those people were. The investigation also made some very significant errors. One of them, it was quite crucial, I think, in terms of the reporting of the fraud, resulted from the fact that the investigator was unaware that Rogers is in the habit of recycling its modems. So he was able to track fraudulent calls to the modem from which they'd been sent, which was in a house somewhere to the southwest of Guelph, inhabited by 5 people who were all completely apolitical and knew nothing about anything. And this was reported as a blank wall. The investigation has run into the sand, etc., etc. Well, in fact, that modem during the election had been in the Conservative Party campaign headquarters. So what was in fact evidence that the fraud had been conducted from the local Conservative Party campaign headquarters was reported instead as a blank wall. And finally, there's a matter that relates to the trial of Michael Sona. I attended just the last day of the trial, but I had I was able to interview Michael Sona in Ottawa at some length as well. The true perversity of this trial, which I would describe as having very serious elements of farce. The true perversity of it is this, that the technical evidence available, and available to anyone who reads the Elections Canada court documents, the information to obtain documents filed by Alan Matthews, that information points unambiguously in the direction of the assistant manager of the Conservative Party campaign, Andrew Prescott. The evidence shows that, and this is evidence from session logs from the RAC9 voice broadcaster, that he and the person who organized the robocalls, let's say Pierre Poutine, were either very closely acquainted or else one and the same person. Prescott and Pierre Jones used the same 2 internet protocol addresses. Pierre Jones logged into 2 of Prescott's voice broadcaster sessions. Prescott stored 3 sessions under the name of Pierre Jones, and on 2 occasions on election day, Jones and Prescott, these are the RAC9 names are client 45, that's Prescott, and client number 93, Pierre Jones. Jones and Prescott logged in within minutes of each other from the same IP address. Now, I would suggest that in an uncorrupted investigation, this information would have justified the laying of charges against Prescott. Or at the very least, it would have justified treating him as a person of interest, of very great interest, of intense interest, instead of which he was granted immunity from prosecution. I mentioned the trial as having an element of farce. There was one issue on which the judge and the Crown Attorney and Michael Sona's attorney agreed on, which was that the testimony of Andrew Prescott was utterly unreliable, that it was filled with prevarications, inventions, reformulations, sudden convenient recall of purported facts that had not been mentioned at any point previously to Elections Canada investigators or indeed to anyone. Now I'll give you another frustrating detail indicating the deficiencies of the investigation, not just in Guelph, but elsewhere. You may recall from early 2012, there was electrifying news from Thunder Bay.
Yeah.
A very courageous woman who had worked as a call center operator for the call center that was sending out many of the live operator calls on behalf of the Conservative Party, was all over the media because she had, during the election, gone to her supervisor and then to the RCMP and to Elections Canada to say that she and her co-workers believed strongly that what they were being asked to do by their employer was unethical and illegal. That in effect they were providing people with misleading information about their voting places. Now, when Annette Desgagnier's evidence came forward, there were, of course, reports throughout the national news media, which were followed a couple of days later by reports in the Toronto Star and CBC News to the effect that the Conservative Party was sending senior officials to Thunder Bay to go through the call center's audio records and files. Now, that report was promptly denied by a Conservative Party lawyer named Fred Laurie, who unfortunately on other occasions has denied reports and turned out to have been dealing with what he had to admit was false information. So his denial, I think, is to my mind at least, suspect. There is no innocent explanation for senior party officials being dispatched to go through those files. Because if you knew that there was nothing illegal about the robocalls that you had been sending out, there would be no possible reason to go through the files. You can anticipate that there would be some cases in which the information your operators provided to voters was correct while the Elections Canada information on the voter information cards was wrong, and there would be others in which the voters had the right information and the information you provided them was incorrect. That would be statistical noise. These would more or less cancel each other out. Why bother? Here's the kicker, though. Elections Canada announced that it was also going to send one of its experienced investigators to Thunder Bay to look into this matter. He would be there, they said, next week. The front door, when he arrived, I'm quite sure was wide open, and there was nothing there, and the hoof prints had been erased. Now, finally, I just want to mention the document that came out that was released by the Commissioner of Canada Elections in April of last year, announcing this was the summary investigation report on robocalls. The Commissioner of Canada Elections is Yves Coté. He's the man responsible for enforcing the Canada Elections Act. In this report, he announced that the investigation was being closed down. This is the investigation in Canada apart from Guelph. It was being closed down because they did not find evidence of intention. In other words, his judgment, and he claimed the judgment of his investigators, was that apart from Guelph, what had happened was merely kind of error, perhaps frivolous, mischievous behavior, but they did not find evidence of criminal intention. Now let's go back for a moment to the complaints data published in that same report. There were 2,448 complaints recorded by Elections Canada. 51% of them complaints about harassment, 49% of them complaints about misinformation. A surprising figure, there were only 1,726 complainants. Now, there's no analysis of this difference in the report, but think about it for a moment. 2,448 complaints, 1,726 complainants. People complaining about two distinct kinds of fraudulent calls. What does this tell us? It tells us that 42% of the complainants were complaining about having received both kinds of calls. Now, you don't have to be a statistician. I've run this figure past statistician colleagues whose jaws drop. You don't have to be a statistician to realize that this is clear evidence of a linkage between the two kinds of calls and clear evidence of targeting and of intention. One last point about the summary investigation report on robocalls. If you look at its executive summary, the first two statements in the executive summary are both either false or misleading. The Commissioner of Canada Elections tells us that his predecessor, William Corbett, who was Commissioner at the time of the election, received approximately 100 complaints about nuisance phone calls or calls providing voters with incorrect poll location information during the election. We know that is not correct. We know that in Guelph alone, in the space of about an hour in the morning of May the 2nd, 2011, the Elections Canada office received more than 100 calls and was unable to answer something like a third more than that number. So that's the very first paragraph of the executive summary. The second piece of information, we're informed that Elections Canada returning officers dealt with complaints about incorrect poll location calls that began to come in on April 29th, that's several days before the election, quote, as errors. This is simply not true. We have the internal emails of Elections Canada officials. They're public documents now. And they were not saying this is a matter of randomness or errors or mistakes or something. They were saying the Conservative Party appears to be doing this. And on April 29th and May 1st, they contacted the Conservative Party's lawyer, Michael Hamilton, to say, here's what's going on, can something be done? So, to sum up then, we have a very serious problem in front of us in the form of a corrupt climate of behavior within one of our leading political organizations in this country. We have what appears to be a secondary problem of a climate of, it might be intellectual corruption or I'm not quite sure what to call it, but a climate of inadequacy, investigative inadequacy, in the agencies that ought to be looking into criminality of this kind. I haven't mentioned the RCMP, but there's lots one could say about them as well, and Elections Canada. And there's an additional problem with the media, because we've had excellent reporting from a small number of reporters. Michael Harris, whose book, Party of One, Sue Watson recommended. I recommend it to you very strongly if you want to get a sense of what it is we're up against. Stephen Maher, Glenn Greger, Lawrence Martin of the Globe and Mail, Althea Raj, Laura Payton of CBC. But you don't need the fingers of more than one hand, really, to total the journalists who've done outstanding work on this issue. So finally, what do we do? I think one of the things we need to do is organize ourselves to have a massive increase in voter turnout in the next election. If you think of the example of the United States, the elections, presidential elections of 2000 and 2004 were stolen. Presidential election of 2008 featured all the same kinds of fraud that the previous ones had featured, but the increase in Democratic Party turnout was sufficient to overwhelm that effect. Same thing in 2012. You can avoid, I think one of the tactics that's going to be used, and I'll save that for questions actually. We do know something about what to anticipate.